So let's do it. I brought our wall back in, and I've added another frame kind of module using our parameters. So I've made the wall a certain width, and it's added 3 more vertical studs and increased the top. So it's like a shorter than 8 foot, 8 foot wide now. And then I've drawn just a squiggly line, a spline rather, a 3D sketch. As you can see, there's a pair of them that are just kind of flowing through the back, and I'm just trying to make it look like wire. And then I've run some pipe features, simple stuff. So those are hanging out in the back, but when we render this, it might show up, it might not, depending on the resolution and what we're using it for. But I want to have some holes cut through here, drilled through, so that it looks like, you know, a real stud is passing through there. Other thing that's kind of bothering me is this texture is so repeated. It looks kind of fakey. So we want to be able to maybe mix that up. But there's something going on with the way we've made this. It's a great model. It's really going to show us a lot as far as like the 3D information. But for rendering, all of these components are tied to each other from this first vertical stud. To prove that, I'll show you if we want to cut a hole through this piece. I'm going to go over here and let's just draw a sketch on that plane. I'm going to make a circle as if we're going to drill through it. Virtually drill. Finish that sketch, extrude through. I'm going to hide the wires. And I'm just going to drag that through just one. Notice that I'm just going through one, but that hole's appearing on all of them. And sure enough, if I accept that, that's what we get. Even if I go inside of, you know, just this component, so I've activated this as the main component here, and we could do the same thing. We could try to extrude that. So the same problem's happening. So the workaround for this is a little funny. What I'm going to do instead is I'm going to activate our main drawing component, just the top, and then I'm going to find that component that makes up that stud. And I'm going to right click on it and go to copy. And then I'm going to go up to wall demo here, the top one again, and right click, paste new. It's the only way I've gotten this to show up, but paste new is kind of like a disconnected version of that component. So what that gives us essentially is repeated pattern of those components. It's just going to copy them right in the same place. So what I've done is I've hidden the originals. And so we see the new ones, I was able to come in and drill those holes in all of these different places. That was one reason I wanted that little bin there, to show that these holes might need to be in different places. They're not all going to be perfectly in line. Sometimes there's like stuff in the way as you're building a wall. Haven't drawn anything here, but we can imagine. And then I want to also pattern this last one, or not pattern, but make a copy of it. It looks like actually we've got it. So we've got 1, 2, there's that one. Oh, so this one is, we'll see what happens when we change that texture. So next order of business, let's change our textures. So we've got this material on several different pieces. Let's go to our render mode. And there's a couple ways we could do it. We could make a new material. We could duplicate this and then like rotate this or change some of the settings and give it more or less rings and grain and knots and those kind of things. Instead, I'm going to see if I can be more clever about it. Maybe we can change the texture map controls just on one board at a time. So I'm just rotating that. So because these are disconnected now, we can do this successfully. I think to a degree of now disorderliness, which is looking good. It might, you know, you could practice play with rotating. I'm using just this grabby move tool. Oops. Back to texture map controls, you know, they're rotated. Sometimes you get different kinds of things. That one actually looks a little fakey. Okay. Not all 2x4s are so great. So right now this end and this end are the same. Let's see what happens if we try to change this one. Do they both change? Hey, they're independent. Cool. Actually, just for some balance, since we have the control over the 2x4s, which is unusual in the real world, we don't always get that. I'm going to try to make it a little more balanced because it's just kind of, it's going to make that composition feel a little heavy. There we go. So some of those lighter grains. Cool. You can see our wires going through. No collisions. We could soften these edges, but I think it's okay. And these wires hanging out, that's fine. You know, maybe I could add some, you know, smaller copper pieces coming out. Probably not the detail we're going to end up getting. Next, I'm going to grab that Hdri, one of those ones that we downloaded last time. Let's see, I got to go find my Hdri folder for this project, and I think I wanted to put this in the garage. This might take a second to load. Those HDRIs can be quite large files. Here we are. And let's maybe find position where this wall is going to look like it makes sense. Okay, why not? We can play with our focal lengths and things in a bit, but I kind of want this to match the existing floor somewhat. But maybe it's off. Maybe we're like, maybe it's a little askew, and that's okay. I want a little bit of room in the foreground for some other things we're going to add. We can play with this brightness later. I'm going to leave it kind of in the middle, just on that slider. The rest of this stuff is fine right now. We also want to make sure if you're in orthographic mode, we want to be in perspective because that's really how our eyes see. Maybe give this a little more, yeah, separation where we can kind of see that that is a cutout. Something's happening in the back. We get a little bit of information from this piece of the wall and this piece of the wall, just for context. Okay, now I want to add some other objects in here. I want to add like a sawhorse and like some tools. So how do we do that? We could draw those things. That would be a whole thing on its own. I've made a folder in my data panel over here for props, and I've imported some things that I've gotten online. You could also draw some things and build them as separate objects and then pull them in. That would be away from our top-down design that we talked about on the first episode of this short series. But if there's kind of separate components that you're building a scene with, it probably makes sense that you're building them in isolation and then bringing them together. Having all of these things built top down for the sake of a render would be pretty intense. Before I start to pull things in here though, because we might have to move things around and move our perspective to do that, I like this view, and I've also made sure I've got the ratio I want. I'm going to turn off depth of field for now. I'm going to save this name view so we can come back to it when we render. So render 4.4. And these existing items that are in our data panel, can't just drag and drop. Maybe you can now. New. Okay. Usually the best way to do it is right click, go to insert into current design. Okay, and it might just kind of come in whatever goofy way it was. Even though these are shown somewhat upright here, different softwares have different interpretations of which direction is up, whether it's, you know, X, Y, or Z. And sometimes those defaults are going to be different than what Fusion has. So sure enough, things are kind of on its side. So, you know, we're not totally lost. We know that at least we have 90 degrees of possibility for how much it's off. So that was easy enough to change there. Again, I'm not really worried about which one it is, X, Y, or Z. I'm just grabbing the handle that makes sense and rotating it around that axis. So it's lower than the wall. So how do we fix that? We're going to have to go to design mode. If we go to, where is it? Modify, align. I'm going to come find the bottom foot of this thing. And you can either align it to our wall, or you could align it to the origin. And then we can click OK. I'm going to hide that origin again. And I like to compose in the render mode. I like to kind of jump back and forth, actually, because we want this kind of at an angle, not so like perfect against the wall. Things are going to be kind of haphazard here. So the best way to move things, I find, is, you could set up some joints like we saw with the bathtub, but it's really unnecessary here. We want to kind of be organic. I like to pre-select the thing I want to move first, and then we can hit, forgot my keys again, one day. I can either hit M on the keyboard, or if you pre-select, you can go up to move, copy. I prefer pre-selecting in this case because if you go to move, copy, then if you see this, by default bodies is selected, and it's not going to let you grab your component. So then you have to do this drop down, and then you have the component, and then you can move it. Same way to get there, but it's just extra steps. So I like to pre-select it, and then it already knows what kind of thing I'm trying to do. So then I can move this around. Notice there's a little chain link icon here. That is because it is linked to this component. So whatever we change here, as long as this link is enabled, that change will follow through into this design. So let's add some more things in here. Let's get some work lights. And this one, I'm not going to worry so much about it being perfectly on the same floor height, the same floor plane, because we're going to have it floating kind of on top of, sitting on top of this sawhorse. Notice sometimes I'm using these arrows to move or translate something, and then sometimes these planes are kind of handy if you know you want to isolate it to a certain plane at a time. But it's also a really good idea to use your front and left, etc. Viewports to really see what you're looking at. You also might want to, break this up into multiple viewports. That's definitely a possibility. That's down here where it says viewports rather than the single view. I think it's a lot of kind of extra noise, but this is kind of like how Rhino works, and it's kind of what I used to use when I was learning CAD. So in some ways it's less clicky, because you can see everything at once and you kind of don't have doubts. The trick with using the single view is sometimes if you grab something, it's hard to tell like what something's on top of or where it is in the other axis. So the reason I like to use that, I just want to make sure it's kind of resting on there. Maybe it needs to come back a little bit. It's floating. So notice this this translate rotate tool stays aligned with the object, but it doesn't stay aligned with your major axis in your scene. So if you want this to be more in conversation with, say, the sawhorse, we can change the pivot. This is also called the pivot, I guess, this center point here, this node. And in this free move mode, it's really helpful that we are aware of how to change this. So I can click set pivot, and then I can either snap to an existing object or just find a plane. But notice we can even have it aligned to this, angled leg of this sawhorse. Even the back end is wherever, it's just kind of good to like see and then see where that alignment is. If you don't like it, you can click that again. Let's say I want this based off the center, but I actually want that close to the object. So you can move it again, but it's based on the alignment, but then you can move that pivot closer, if that makes sense. So let's do that one more time. I'm going to show us back here first. And then it's important we hit that checkbox before we try to move something, because we're just creating an additional offset now, which isn't kind of the what we were trying to do. So I'm going to hit check, and then notice I'm moving from back here. So if that's like counterintuitive, we can set that pivot. You know, we can set it somewhere really far away, and then we can move it close. You know, maybe we can even move it. Again, we haven't accepted this yet. It's not done. So maybe we can move that pivot so it's close to the front, because we want to now drop this down, but maybe not -5 degrees, maybe 1. Just kind of fidget with some numbers. Cool. You can change the snapping. I believe it's here. Increments. You can set this to be fixed. I don't like to play with this so much because sometimes this linear increment gets really frustrating when it's set wrong. It almost feels like you can't move something. But the rotational increment, I think, is worth probably trying out. Let's go ahead and set it. Let's try it out. So let's bring a new object in and we'll see how it's different. So that looks okay to me. Let's bring another light in, or we could even copy this. So I've done Control C, Control V, or we could go to Move Copy and we can say Create Copy. And now we've duplicated it. Let's have it kind of pointing back the other way, just being aware of our ground plane. You can see with the shadows on, it does kind of show you when you're really not intersecting the ground plane. What Fusion's doing is it's adapting that ground plane offset to the objects in the scene. So we've got a new copy. All right. 2 lights. Let's bring a hammer in. I'm going to show you all where I got these things in a moment. You can tell I like drawing things, but sometimes things are a bit much. Still, like, I think a good exercise to do. I've actually learned a lot from just bringing other people's models, but you can also kind of make them your own. You know, I say that with like a degree of respect to the maker. You wouldn't want to, you know, use someone's work dishonestly, I suppose. But you can retexture these things. I've recolored this hammer and the sawhorse and the lights in these components up there. Just kind of looking where this is resting against the sawhorse. Maybe it's turned out a little bit so we can really see what it is more perpendicular. I'd say it's okay if things are intersecting a little bit. It's probably better than having a gap. I think the shadows will be a little bit more realistic. Since we're not doing parametric modeling anymore, it's okay. The things don't have to be the quote perfect. One more thing I'll add in before we switch to the browser, and I can show us a good source for these things. Just gonna add in a switch box. So you can see my snapping is now different. I'm set to not 5 degrees, but I can go as fine as 1 degree. I think the 5 degrees is helpful when you're, you know, doing most modeling, because that snap is good to keep things aligned to like 90 degrees at a time, 45 degrees so you don't get off. And this is where I think that 1 degree of snap is going to be too much. So I'm going to change that back to adaptive. And adaptive means you can, Fusion's going to adjust to how close you are zoomed in. It's going to change how aggressive it is with the snapping. So let's say that's down there and that box needs to be wired, so we're going to pull some more Romex through there before we finish the sheetrock. And we've got a hole in the wall. But we might need some other tools and some other things. So I'm going to flip over to Grabcad. I did want to explain first that there's a bunch of different file formats out there in 3D world. This is, I can put a link to this article, but it's how many 3D file formats are there? Tons. It kind of makes it confusing and frustrating sometimes. There's proprietary formats that you can't open with all softwares. Fusion has become better and better about opening other formats, like a SolidWorks format you didn't used to be able to open. But there's some language on the site that I like. There's like a quote neutral file format, like an STL or an IGS, STEP. We're going to see some of these in a moment when we flip to Grabcad. Fusion can accept most of these things, but we'll kind of see what those limits are. And some files are more compatible or more editable in a software like Fusion than, say, like a software like Blender. A mesh, like an OBJ, STL, FBX, these are going to be most editable in things like Maya, 3ds Max, Blender, and when you're making video games too, those are file formats that are going to show up a lot. This is a good illustration of what a mesh is. It's made up of triangles. They're kind of like fixed, discrete objects that you can sculpt them in things, but you don't have all the parametric, formula-based things that we've been doing in Fusion that let us kind of make these adjustments based on the definition of the thing rather than like what the thing looks like, if that makes sense. So there's like an example of a tessellated sphere. To get a sphere with triangles, it takes so many triangles that actually becomes a really heavyweight file that takes up a lot of space in your computer and slows things down. This is a slightly different thing. It's kind of between solid geometry. It's called Nurbs. It's kind of like what we were doing with the sculpting with the bathtub when we were doing the water, the T-splines. So you have points that are then interpolated into curves. And then there's solids. So solids are like watertight things that are really based off of like a formula that defines it. So like a sphere has a certain formula and Fusion is using that kind of formula. Whereas like a sphere that looks like this, the computer really doesn't know about its sphereness, or the software doesn't. So they have benefits and limitations. So with that being said, I'm over in Grabcad. This is a website that's free to use. You can make an account to download things. I've been using it for a long time, really just to like take other people's models apart and learn how they built them. You can search for things up here. You can even choose the software. So there are people, building in Fusion 360. Maybe they didn't make something called miter saw, but you can open something that someone's drawn and you might be able to see their history timeline that, are ribbon down here, and you might be able to see how they put something together. So that's really been informative to me with softwares like SolidWorks, these kind of history-based modeling softwares at least. So it looks like there's not a miter saw model native to the Fusion 360 format. That's okay. I'm going to grab this one, and we can see when I'm logged in, I'm able to download things, and I can also see what files are available from this author. We've got 3 different file formats. We have an SDLPRT, STL, STEP. So 2 of these already I can see are different than the others. So SLDPRT is a SolidWorks part file, and then an STEP is one of these more neutral solid files. Neutral. STL, we could bring in, Fusion will be able to look at it, but it's going to be really hard to texture in the way we've been texturing and making materials in Fusion. So either STEP or SolidWorks file. I'm going to grab the SolidWorks file because I have a feeling it has a little bit more information because it was probably drawn in the SolidWorks. So download that, save to the desktop. I've already downloaded it. And then while we're here, I'm also going to look for a tape measure model. So this one looks good. I'm also just sorting by most downloaded because sometimes you get some funny results otherwise. And I've got some different options here. This person has a folder of some other things. So we can see within a folder, we also have SolidWorks, a bunch of SolidWorks parts in, I'm not sure what language that is, but that's cool. And then we have an SLD ASM, which is a SolidWorks assembly model. So all of these things point to this model, and I want to download that also to just see the difference. Then STEP, IGS, these are those kind of neutral file formats. Not so sure about an X_T. It's mysterious. So I'm going to download this whole thing. It's a little bit big. We're not going to use all those things, so maybe we can delete some things later. And we'll see the way that we put things into Fusion doesn't necessarily store space in the same way that you would organize files in Finder or Windows Explorer. So I'll go ahead and open that zip file and I'll extract it. And then I think we can get rid of this file just for clarity. Okay, so we've got our tape measure and then we've got our miter saw file we downloaded. So first thing, let's go with the simple one. These are both SolidWorks parts files, but STEP, IGS, they're all going to behave pretty similarly. So I'm in the folder that I want these things to go to. A couple ways you can do this. You can go up here in the file icon and go to upload. Notice there's no import anywhere. We'll do a form of importing in another tutorial in the future, but that's limited to DXFs, like two-dimensional vectors, two-dimensional models. So what we need to do is we're going to upload. So Fusion's going to take our model, and let's find it. Where are we? Messy desktop. Okay. So we're going to upload this, and it's going to end up going into the wall prop folder. We can see its file size, and it's actually going to convert it on the cloud. So it might take a little while. The bigger the file, the more complicated, obviously, the more that's going to kind of make a mess. Let's try that other one that was an assembly. This is tricky, and it's taken me some practice to kind of figure out how it works best. So our tape measure, if you just kind of select everything in here, sometimes it works, but let's click on the assembly type model first. Okay, and Fusion is aware that it has sub-assemblies or parts, which we're kind of familiar with that concept from how Fusion works. SolidWorks has a similar format. So I'm going to select everything but that assembly. Okay, and now it looks like it's satisfied Fusion's concerns. It looks like some of these symbols and characters aren't going to do so well, but let's see how it goes. So we're going to upload that. Close my desktop. I'm going to close this. Let's go ahead and open that miter saw file. Okay, so already we can see the software that drew this, things had a different up axis. So we could rotate it. That might be a really quick, simple way to do it. We could select everything here and rotate it. Looks like my computer's having trouble with that. We need to have bodies selected. There we go. So we could rotate this. I want to show you another way to do it though. It's not rotating it, but for the sake of just this object, it might simplify it. And it's a good trick to just keep things organized for other purposes. So I want to look at this model where I would describe it as the front of the object. And I'm going to click on the view cube at whatever nearest face it is. So, you know, if you want to call this the front, so be it. But I want to click so I'm looking directly at that plane on the view cube up here. Maybe you can't see it behind my face, but we're looking at the view cube. And I'm going to click on this drop down arrow and I'm going to say set current view as front. That's it. And then if you also want, actually I'm going to close this. So now things are a little bit more aligned. You notice the shadow changed also. What I also like to do is just find a top corner and say set current view as home, and then fit to view is fine. And then watch what happens on this icon over here when I save. Might take a second. but it's rotated, it's oriented. So we're going to see that doesn't fix our problem when we bring it into our other assembly, but it's close. It helps a little bit, at least, to just stay organized. Oh, what's happened over here? So we got an error import from our import from a report on an import. Okay. The file being open does not exist. That sounds great. Luckily, so maybe that's no good. This is what it did end up bringing us. It's parts of a tape measure. It's kind of cool. Let's take the other file that I downloaded for that, which was just a simple STEP. Let's see what happens when we bring that in. So sometimes it doesn't work. I'm not sure what the failure there was. Could be those characters even. I mean, I hate to be like that, but I'm in this case, it could be the characters are confusing the files that are that SolidWorks format is looking for all those assembly pieces. Okay, so other thing about this miter saw, just while we wait for that to upload, I like this a lot. It already has excuse me, colors from what I assume was drawn in SolidWorks. These might not be like materials that have lots of texture and stuff, but it's color, and you can see all these different things are applied to it. So it's going to give us some richness without having to do a lot of work individually. If we want to tune it later, we could. Let's see how tape measure's doing. Usually you have to wait till an icon shows up. While we wait, let's bring our miter saw into the group. I'm going to try that clicking and dragging and see what happens. Okay, clicking and dragging works. Unfortunately, you can't click and drag from your desktop onto that. That you have to go through the upload process. I know that. So we got to rotate this 90 degrees. I'm going to look at the top viewport. Swing it over here. Let's go back to render and see how things are feeling. Okay, there's a lot of things in this scene, so it might be starting to get a little heavy on the computer. Actually, I think I'm going to put that friend. Hit M on the keyboard, and I'm going to try to grab that plane and balance this out. Maybe moving things in the render viewport is not recommended. Okay, I'm getting a little bit of an air gap here, a little bit of like hovering going on from, maybe it's the miter saw actually. I'm going to update that view. And actually I will move that since we're here. Oh my goodness. Grab our miter saw, move, and just, I'm going to inch it up. Yeah, I think it was the miter saw doing it. Okay, so I think we just need to be 1 inch above the ground. Cool. Actually, I'm going to rotate it the other way. It's just kind of compositional things. Things are just kind of all facing too much the same direction right now. It's funny that it says SolidWorks on the side. If you do have access to whatever proprietary software that files in, if it's a Rhino format, if it's a Blender file, if it's SolidWorks, if you do have access to SolidWorks, even if it's an education license, which I understand you can get, it might be worth exporting that as something else if that seems to be more dependable on your workflow. If you're not using Fusion and you don't have those options, you can export things as meshes in SolidWorks. Since we're here, maybe make this a little more wide angle. Cool. Okay, I like that alright. You might change it later. Okay, I think we can close our miter saw. We're gonna get to the fun stuff in a second. We're just building this. So our tape measure doesn't have any materials. So I'm gonna show how we can apply some things just like really quickly, and then how that will update in our scene. So I'll go ahead and let's put it in the scene first, actually. Since we're talking about things updating, let's just do it. I'm gonna go back to design mode. Come find that. Other thing about importing files in formats like those solid formats we talked about, STEP, SolidWorks, IGES, those are going to contain units. More often than not, I usually have luck with them having units on like built into the file. So what I'm saying is sometimes when you get like a mesh, like a STL OBJ file, it's unclear if it was drawn in centimeters, millimeters, feet, fathoms. You know, it could be so many things, and it's without knowing what the maker was doing with that, like what their intent was. Sometimes it can be really frustrating when you bring a file in and you're trying to match it to other real world dimensions, and it just nothing really translates. So if you have a paper trail, or if you're if you kind of know more about the file, how it was made, it's probably fine, but just something to be aware of. Can be frustrating. Might change the angle out later, but so okay, we've got our tape measure here. I'm gonna go ahead and save our main file. It might take a second for it to catch up. And here's our tape measure. It's upside down. I'm not gonna worry about it too much. I'm gonna go to modify, get our appearances going. Let's make it something plastic. Let's get some green in the scene. I've got bodies components selected. See, there's two clamshells. It's kind of a nice model. And then let's make this, the tape part of the tape measure, matte yellow. Let's see what happens if we do that. That looks fine to me. Okay, and then I also just want to make sure that this is like really a metal material. I have a feeling it's maybe not. Yeah, it's just kind of like an opaque material. So we could just take our default steel satin, apply that. Because it's such a small object, it'd be nice if some of those reflections stood out when we render it. Okay, I'm going to save that. I'm going to close this first. So saving our tape measure, go back to the wall demo, and we get our flag that we remember from the bathtub build, and we get a warning that one component is out of date. Which one is that? You can look down here if you have any doubts, or if you just want to make sure that you're aware of what's going to happen before you press this. And it's going to bring in that new version of the file. And we can get our tape measure with our cute new materials on it. So let's do a little canvas render. See how things are looking. And we've got our strange error going on with that material. I think I want to rotate this maybe over some so we can get a little more depth to our scene. Yeah, now we can see that plug. Maybe what I'll do is I'll rotate the background HDR scene. If your scroll wheel on your mouse is like a little twitchy, which mine is right now, it might be worth trying some of these more precise controls. I say they're more precise, they're just a little more focused. My mouse wheel just keeps rolling where it doesn't need to be rolling. Okay. Let's move you. I'm going to carefully try to grab. Oh. We'll have to update our named view again. Forgot to update it. Yeah, let's swing over here. Cool. Update. Go to scene settings. Click on our little translate icon. Cool. I like that. And let's do an in-canvas render and just see where things are at. So I want these work lights to feel like work lights. Right now they just look like they're not really doing their thing. You know, they're not plugged into the wall. Maybe that's the problem. It's okay. So can we edit these from here? Can we go into materials and can we change, you know, this bulb? Can we make this bulb an actual bulb? So let's just type in LED. Wow, we've got lights. I can even open up our component here and maybe we can see, is it possible? We've got a halogen bulb component. Fantastic. This is why I love borrowing people's models. It looks like it actually did let me change it. That's surprising. See how that renders out. Cool, okay. I was expecting to have to go back to the model and change it. Usually I haven't had luck changing materials in a scene. It's often a better practice to right click and break that link if you want to change it directly in the scene, which I don't recommend doing. I recommend going back to the file or the individual design and changing it. But I think I want to do that actually in this case because notice it didn't change the other one, and I want these lights to be the same. I want them to behave the same. When I adjust one, I want the other one to adjust. So rather than having to go back and forth, I think well, actually, we can do that. I changed my mind. We can use that same material twice, of course. Let's confine the other. Oh, this is the second light. There's our first light. Well, let's confine that bulb. Bulb contact, halogen bulb. All right. We're upgrading it to an LED. Okay, now I did get a warning that said this has materials assigned to it already. Oh, something happened there. Ah, we hit that 2x4. That's why. Okay, try one more time. I like to kind of just pre-select and highlight it if I found it because it was maybe work to come find that. Yeah, I think we accidentally nicked that. So let's close this. Let's close that drawer, go back to our render angle. Whoop. We scoot over a bit. I like that. Let's update that. Okay, and let's do an in-canvas render and see if we get some light coming out of there. I like that, but it's really not adding a lot of light to the scene. So I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna change this on the fly. We can change I'm not really sure what this unit is. I think it's something about candles. And I'm gonna just make this, let's make it as bright as we can. I'm adding zeros. It's only gonna let us go so far, unfortunately. I'm gonna click OK. So how do we exaggerate these work lights? How do we make them really feel like they're adding light to the scene? Well, we have to darken the scene. So this is where I was explaining earlier that there's a difference between the exposure slider and the brightness slider. The brightness has to do with the environment itself. So if we drop this down to null, you see the only light in the scene are the work lights. I'm going to step this up in units of 100. That was not units of 100. Let's jump it up a little more. Okay, I like that. This is looking pretty cool. So what is really amazing about putting a light source in an object is that it's going to cast shadows you know, whatever is in its way. We're tracing rays of light here. So as this work light, that bulb that is emitting light, it's reflecting inside of there and it's passing through the grill. It's leaving behind shadows. Now, it's super processor heavy to do something like this. The computer is calculating all of the little rays of light inside of there, bouncing around. If that object is reflective inside of there, it's doing a lot of extra work. So this is sort of sometimes extravagant, but if you can get a sample down, we can render this on the cloud and things should be pretty sweet. They should be pretty not hard on our computer. So I'm going to stop that. There's some adjustments I want to make. I think the tape measure is not really showing up. Oh, scroll wheel is wild style. Okay. Let's swing this around. Okay. And I think I also wanted to change these work lights to maybe be a little more purposeful. Maybe not purposeful, but maybe more composed. I think we might add another one too. So I want to rotate this on this other axis that we can't see. So this is why I'm looking up to do that, just to find that. And I'm going to bring this out some. And if we wanted to move the whole sawhorse, we would have to select each component in one selection and then move it. Since we haven't joined anything together with joints, if we move one thing, like if we move the sawhorse, nothing else is coming with it. But we would have to, you know, select each piece and then we can move it. We might even be able to make a group. No luck. Okay, very well. I'm gonna add, it's just gonna increase our render times, but let's add another work light. So that error is actually something that I wanted to bring up. Right now, none of these locations have shown up on our ribbon of history down here. So if we were to close this file without saving it, all of those moving around moments haven't been recorded. We've brought the objects in. We can see all these objects here, but we haven't captured their position. So you should see when you start to move things around up here, there's revert, which I'll click on that and oh my gosh, everything kind of goes back. Let's go back to undo revert and then capture position. We get a new item on the timeline. Should be good now. I was going to add another work light. That seems like it's floating. I wonder why that is. Is that other one really up so high? Oh, I know what's up. We are in perspective mode. That's the trick. We need to go to orthographic. It's good to, when you're doing stuff in the design viewport, when you're moving things around and want them to be kind of lined up to it in a sense, good idea to keep your view in orthographic, which you can find under the view cube. Okay, I think last thing I want to do before we render this out, I'm going to render on my machine just so we can kind of see some progress for the final render. We'll do some in canvas stuff, but I want to show how to make a component from something we've drawn. So I'm going to go back to a module that we drew together, okay, or another piece. And I'm going to just grab this sheetrock piece and I want to take this and make it its own separate component piece that we can add to our wall props for our scene folder. So we should be able to save copy as. Great. So that looks promising. Go to wall props. We'll just call it sheetrock, save it. Hopefully shows up as, it should just be the piece of sheetrock itself. I'll go ahead and close this. Our tape measure. Let's open it just to check. Beautiful. Now we've got another cutout down here. Maybe we can change that. Just gonna turn that off. Actually, you know what would be better probably is we don't have tape on our sheetrock. I'm just gonna turn off all this stuff, and we're just gonna make it a color. Oh, let's make it that paper actually. Might look a little off, but we're gonna try to match it. It's not changing, that's encouraging. We change the whole thing. Okay, let's take the polystyrene, and then let's take that paper, go to one side. Ooh. Okay, that looks good. I'm going to change the image. Let's go to edit image, and we can actually, I'm hoping, this is kind of a, this is hacky, but we can change the brightness. So instead of trying to find this file or redrawing something, like going to all that trouble, I'm just going to find it and darken it. Maybe we can invert things here too. Okay. If we need to change that, we can later. So that looks like a thing. Save that. We can close that one. Here's our scene. Let's bring this into the mix. I'm just going to put a stack in the background, like we're, you know, have a lot of work to do. Okay, showed up in a familiar spot. Oops, we want to look at it like this. I'm going to drop it down. And then let's go to modify, align, click on that face, click on bottom of our 2x4. It just makes that less fidgety. This is probably going to be largely out of focus when we actually render, but we've got our paper texture all the way around. That's okay. A little bit of contrast. We'll now, let's just go ahead and we'll capture that position. Sometimes it'll prompt you when you start to do other work. It's kind of like a warning. We can pattern this using the origin up. And let's just do that for now and just kind of add to this quantity. And instead of extent, let's see, we got 12 of them. We got a lot of work to do. Let's change that spacing to, I think we made them a 1/2 inch thick, so let's make just a little bit of gap so we end up with a shadow there. And I'll click OK. So all this blue stuff is showing up. It's a sketch. Okay. So while we're here, so I was just noticing this like blue halo on each layer. Sometimes the geometry, even if it's like construction geometry or sketch geometry, will carry through when you bring it into another assembly. So make everything that one. Let's take our paper. Okay, now we're in business. Great. Save. And now we're going to get a warning because all of these need to be updated. Okay, this stack might be a little bit too perfect. So I'm gonna be totally mad, and I'm just gonna kind of type in some numbers. I'll start from the top and work down. Let's see, let's figure out which axis this is. So I'm just gonna change it to something, and then, okay, so it's Y. Let's make this. It's a really bad stack, huh? The whole degree really adds up. Maybe we should be less aggressive. Some of them can stay there. This is really fussy stuff. Maybe just one more. What a mess. Let's go back to render and close this. Wow. Save that. Those might be a little light, but we're going to stick with it for now. We're going to keep moving. Save our document because we're going to do some intense computer work now. Let's get our view going. We want to look up a little more. Okay, let's look at an in-canvas render and just see where we're at. That looks pretty cool. I think instead of this light facing away from us, I want to see a little bit of the source. I want to see what motivates that light source more than it just blasting something else. So I'm going to stop that. And I'm going to go back to design because it seems to be just running a little faster. And let's come find the last light we made. Hit M, bring it over here, just turn it around. It's floating in the air. Okay. So I think it's floating in the air because we're using, not totally sure actually, but we can adjust it simply enough. It's a lot of back and forth and back and forth. That's kind of how rendering goes. If you want something to look, a specific way, it just takes a lot of trial and error. Instead of moving that again, I'm going to move over here. And let's look up a little bit more. Okay, I think we're ready for an update to our named view. For sure. Okay, it's 3 o'clock, so we've been at it for an hour. But I think we're coming up with some stuff that I think is looking pretty cool. I don't know what we would do with this, but here we are, sheetrocking. I'm going to come up a little bit more, kind of losing the edge of that. Cool. When we're using these lights, it's just going to take a long time to render if we didn't have them on. For example, if I hide them, we're going to see the scene renders wicked fast relatively. We're not going to see all these kind of noisy bits. When we introduce these lights, it's just so much more calculation for the computer to have to do. And again, like, beware if you think your computer can't handle this. Just bring this slider really, just so it can only do a little bit, just so you can get an idea of what the light is doing, and some of the trial and error is going to come in another step, and that's using the cloud. So I think we're ready for that. say so. I'm going to pause my in-canvas render. I'm going to give this a save. And just for time's sake, so we can see some results, you could do the cloud render, but today I'm going to do local render so we can see it happening on my machine. And I'm not going to do a super high resolution one. Let's just do it the native format. Let's see how long this takes. You can choose, JPEG, TIFF, PNG. PNG is fine. And let's hit render. You can make this excellent rather than final. Let's just see how that goes. Making this a smaller resolution too probably is a good idea, come to think. Just since we don't really know, it's like a Polaroid at this point, like we don't really know what we're gonna do before we hit that button on that long render. We probably want to be a little more careful. So it is totally consumed, the computer. Okay, we're going now. Now it's doing its next step. Okay, I was just checking out how much of said computer is being used. And we should get a new little thing down here. There we go. There's our icon for the new render. Okay. I'm liking the way it looks. I haven't done any depth of field or anything like that yet. Okay, some of these, light spots in the back, maybe that's totally not realistic. Because why do we have work lights on if it was daytime outside? Maybe there's just not lights in here. And that garage door can't open. But coming for the story. Other thing I want to do is I want to rotate this. So that's just, I think, a good preview. We could stop that because I don't think this is going to be our final thing, but I'm looking at things to make changes of. So maybe I want to rotate the whole HDRI around. Maybe there's a better spot in the garage, but I'm liking the way things look. And I also think I want some depth of field. Maybe like this work light is going to be the focal point and everything else will fade out. Or this hammer is the focal point because we have this hole in the wall. Maybe that's what, caused that. So start to tell a story there. So back to scene settings. Let's see if just anything else makes sense. That's not bad, actually. Well, that's not going to work, obviously. Sometimes there's like a lot of busy foreground in these HDRIs. Yeah, let's stick over here. I just wanted to rotate a little bit just to have a little bit of separation so we can really tell that's a hole in the back. And let's turn on depth of field. Yes, we know. I'm going to select. We get that little tiny green dot. That's going to show us where our depth of field is focused or center of focus. I think I like our field of view from our lens. Better ratio set. Save it one more time. This render looks like it's still going, but it should have stopped. That's a sign that it stopped. I think it's still catching up. So let's do like a little off to the races here. We'll do one render at max here at 1920 1080. Do it at the excellent mode. And then we're going to do one in the cloud. I should have given the cloud a head start, but I'll post these images and we can do a side-by-side comparison because it's going to take longer than I think folks are going to want to sit around for both of these to finish. The local one will probably finish before the cloud just because waiting in line. Since we have this education account, we don't have, priority in that queue. That's okay. Let's see our resource consumption again. So you can see all of, I try not to nerd out too much on this stuff, but I was saying before with a lot of the modeling processes in Fusion, it's only using a few of these cores at a time. But when we're rendering, we're maxed out. So you can see it's using the CPU, the processor. It's using all of these threads to do that rendering. So it's pretty intense, and you can't, unfortunately, limit how many cores it's using at once. So, it's a good thing I can still stream this to y'all right now. Could be dubious with other computers to do so many things at once. So back to here. So same settings, we'll do a cloud render. It's going to say how many credits are required. We get those unlimited sort of credits. I've noticed if you try to stack up a lot of cloud renders at once, you'll get kind of denied a certain amount of active renders at a time, but hasn't totally stopped me. Just gonna have to, wait it out. Okay, so I will post those renders. Maybe actually let's look at this one, but I'll post those in the description. I'll upload them somewhere where everyone can see, and then we can compare, see if the cloud render shows a little bit differently than the native render, the local hardware render. So this is going to take an hour to render. Well, I will post these and we'll check it out then. So thanks for hanging out. This concludes the wall project, and today we brought in some other people's models to add to our own really kind of fussy parametric wall model that we've turned into this scene of either progress or destruction or just stasis. But thanks again for hanging out. I'm going to think of another project to do. I think I want to incorporate some vectors from programs like Illustrator, or like CorelDRAW or Inkscape that you can bring in and start to turn into 3D shapes. So if you have experience with Illustrator, you're already doing CAD, but maybe you want to make things 3D. So hope that's an encouraging thing to look forward to. And I will talk to y'all next week. Have a great weekend. Be well, be safe.